Aloha, you are watching Living Delicious with Helena and our special, my favorite series, Die Delicious. We are living delicious and we are dying delicious. Today we have a really special guest, a person I was looking forward to interview for so long, Kathryn Tucker. Welcome to the show.
So nice to meet you.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you for coming. Kathryn, for people who have watched our shows, they heard your name mentioned several times because you have so much contributed to the issue of dying with dignity, aid in dying. Can you tell us why? What are you so important?
Well, thank you for saying that.
Yes.
I've worked for 20 years on protecting and expanding the rights of terminally ill patients.
Yes.
And I'm very passionate about it. I think that as people approach the end of life, they should have choices, they should have information, and they should be supported in making the choice that's most consistent with their values and beliefs. So all of our work at Compassion and Choices is animated by that.
Okay, so you are Compassion and Choices what?
I'm the Director of Legal Affairs for Compassion and Choices.
For the whole nation.
For the nation. And we are a national nonprofit,
Yes.
and we advocate on behalf of terminally ill patients all around the country in every state. And we have members and supporters in every state. And we work on a broad range of issues that empower patients with more information and more choices.
Do people who would like to get any help from Compassion and Choices have to be certain age, certain gender, certain nationality, certain religion? What are the limitations of getting any help from Compassion and Choices?
Any patient or family member of a patient can call us. We have an 800 number, we have a website, and receive information about what their options are as they approach death due to terminal illness.
So you're not limited to anything or any age,
No,
anybody?
no. And we work with patients typically who are within 6 months of death, so they've been given a prognosis of 6 months or less life expectancy. But sometimes people are curious before that, and we also provide
While
them
they're still
information.
conscious.
Yes, or while they're in the early stage of their illness, and we provide information to those patients. But the most intensive counseling of patients is patients who are getting closer to death.
And they can get free information from Compassion and
Yes,
Choices?
yes. They can talk to an end-of-life care counselor who's typically a hospice provider or social worker in their former career who now works with Compassion and Choices counseling patients.
Okay, so now, I'm watching you as you talk. You said you have been passionate about this for over 20 years. You already look young, vivacious, vital.
You're so
At the
cute.
beginning of the show, you were doing some yoga.
Right,
Fun.
right.
So I wonder, is it working with terminally ill patients and constantly, basically your clientele does not go to school, they die. Isn't that kind of sad, and does that pull you down as a person?
Right. Well, a lot of what the patients who we work with are confronting is sad.
Yes.
And the joy that I take in my work is making sure that those patients who are addressing really difficult issues are empowered, that they're empowered with information, that they're supported in their decision making, and that they're able to make a choice that is most comfortable for them. I find a lot of personal satisfaction in doing that, and I find that the patients that we work with are so grateful to have open, candid discussion, because in our culture that is rare.
Yes,
and so
we don't want to talk about dying.
Exactly,
ever.
exactly. So I think people are really grateful and really welcome what we offer. So.
And do you personally talk with patients as well?
Well, I'm not an end-of-life care counselor, I'm a lawyer, but I
Yes.
do talk with patients who are involved in either some of the lawsuits we bring, because we are involved in a wide variety of lawsuits that are designed to expand patient choice. So I work with those patients to make sure that they are able to tell their story to the court in a way that helps the court understand why it's so important to rule in their favor.
Yes.
Or I also work with patients who may be giving testimony in front of a legislature if the question is in front of the legislature. So
they use your voice and your expertise to express their situation.
Right. We work with them to help them share their story in a way that is compelling.
Mm-hmm. And this sounds very noble and beautiful, but also I know that you are actually very responsible and involved for 2 or more landmark cases. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about what happened in 1998 and 2006 that actually shaked up the entire state?
Right, the entire nation.
The entire nation. You have so much more than just helping few cases in the court.
Right. Well, a lot of our cases are designed to promote change in the direction of expanding choice. So in the mid-1990s, we did develop 2 cases that we took to the U.S. Supreme Court that were asking the question, is the choice of a dying patient for a peaceful death something that is protected by the United States Constitution? Mm-hmm. And our United States Constitution guarantees individuals liberty. And we argued that as a matter of liberty, the choice of a dying patient for a peaceful death should be protected, meaning that if the patient wanted to ask their physician for a prescription for medication that would enable them to achieve a peaceful death, that the patient's choice is protected, that the government couldn't take that choice away from the patient. So those cases are very well known. Actually, what the U.S. Supreme Court said...
That's exactly what I wanted to say. What is your contribution personally to U.S. Supreme Court that actually empowers everybody?
Right. Well, what the U.S. Supreme Court said was we may find a federal constitutional right in the future. For the moment, we leave this issue to the states, which is a traditional way that the court system works. Mm-hmm. And so we have moved the issue forward in states. One of the things that the Supreme Court did establish that's so important in that pair of cases is that dying patients have the right to receive as much pain medication as they need to get relief, even if it advances the time of death. Mm-hmm. And so that was a very significant holding. Mm-hmm. And now you start to see that embraced in medicine, in how doctors practice, and really changing care at the bedside.
So is this now legal in every state?
In every state in the nation, patients are able to receive as much pain medication as they need to get relief, even if it advances the time of death. So that was a significant outcome of those cases. And then with regard to whether patients can choose aid in dying, which is the obtaining a prescription specifically to precipitate a peaceful death, that issue has come back to the states. And so we have gone forward in a number of states with legislation that permits that. So the states of Oregon and Washington have such laws. We've also gone into different states in lawsuits in the court system where we've achieved a state Supreme Court ruling that supports aid in dying, and that happened recently in Montana. So we have been able to move this issue forward through the states, and as you know, we're active now in Hawaii.
In Hawaii. So before we speak about Hawaii, I want to ask you a lot about Hawaii. Can we clarify certain terminologies? What is the difference between aid in dying, between giving as much medication, even if, between murder, assisted suicide? How do we clarify that? And does anything in the law or the court, are they really specific about the wording used for that issue?
Such an important question, because how we talk about something very much influences how we think about it.
Yes.
Right. And so opponents like to use language that's very negative and very pejorative and value-laden and scary.
Made you look very judged.
Exactly. So opponents will use the term assisted suicide because suicide has so much negative connotation, and they are very smart in their campaign to oppose choice to use that word. It's very powerful, it's very effective. Advocates for patients being empowered with choice know that the choice of a dying patient for a peaceful death is no kind of suicide. And so we've worked hard to educate the public and professionals about that. And so we use the term aid in dying, which now has been widely accepted by many national medical groups who recognize that the use of the word suicide is inappropriate and that we should use accurate, value-neutral language.
So if I would be the person who is now watching for the first time, I may even think that you are just masking a suicide in the words of aid in dying. If somebody is terminally ill and in excruciating pain, they may just say, screw it, I just want to die. I want to commit suicide. Give me the pill. Prescribe me something. What is the difference between that desperation for wanting to stop your life and therefore using any prescription and aid in dying?
Right. Well, I think the difference is that a patient who's at the end stage of a terminal illness is dying because of the terminal illness.
Yes.
Right. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And
I'm talking about that kind of person. But
yes.
They are, let's say, in a lot of pain and they still have 5 or 6 months to live.
Right. And still, what is bringing the closure to that life is their terminal illness. And so that individual should be able to decide based on their own values and beliefs how much suffering to endure before they cross the threshold to death. And so the patient who obtains and ingests medication to bring about a peaceful death, we would still say that person is dying of their cancer or ALS, whatever their underlying condition is that has brought them to the threshold of death.
So on the moment of death, they will be discharged from their papers will say they died from cancer?
Correct. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So for example, in the states I mentioned that have statutes that empower patients with this choice, that is how it is handled, that the death is not a suicide, it is not deemed a suicide, and the cause of death is the underlying illness. And that's so much more respectful of the patient because, again, most patients who come to this juncture, they have had a long course where they've tried everything. They've had surgery, they've had chemotherapy, they've had radiation.
Alternatives.
They've worked long and hard to try to cure the illness, and to suggest that they are committing suicide when they realize that there are no curative options is not respectful to the patient. It's not respectful to their physician who's worked with them through all of those attempts. So we're really working to remind people that that choice is very different than suicide. Suicide is traditionally understood to be the choice of someone who has an indefinite lifespan and who probably has impaired decision-making because of a crisis or a mental illness.
What about religion? If we think about life as what happens to us, life is life, it's fun, and then we put a law in it, then we don't have actually freedom to die normally, but how God wanted us to die. What do you say when it comes to people? Because I believe people who are watching are having some conflicts in their mind about religion. And what can I choose? Am I choosing to die how God wanted me to die normally? Or am I choosing the pill and escape life? What would you say to that?
Right. Well, in modern day society, no one dies naturally.
What do you mean? Can you explain?
Yes. So a patient who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness is already receiving all kinds of medical interventions that stave off the so-called natural death.
Yes.
So we are prolonging life, we're extending life in an unnatural way with these interventions. Tubes, machines, surgery, powerful medications, powerful radiation. None of that is natural. So we do a lot to prolong and extend life, and that's great because people do get a lot of value out of that. I think that the challenging thing for our culture and our society is recognizing that at the end of all those many interventions, we may have brought someone to a place where dying is very prolonged and difficult, and we can't cure them.
So instead of we are not prolonging life anymore, we are prolonging dying.
Prolonging the dying process to a point that some patients find unbearable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people, if you explain like this, do people feel more comfortable with their religious beliefs?
Right. Well, I think, many faith traditions are very supportive of people being able to make their own autonomous choices.
Can you tell us which ones?
Well, I think you see it in virtually every faith tradition, but I think that what we hear is we often hear a loud and vocal voice of the hierarchy, the organized religion, not so much the faithful people themselves, but we hear, for example, from the United States Catholic Conference. And that organization has fairly rigid views about how patients should approach end of life. And so many Catholic faithful don't share those views, but you still see the church as an entity expressing those views.
Yes.
I would say that faith tradition in particular has rigid views about end-of-life choice that don't support patients being empowered.
My grandma is 89 years old. I asked her, Grandma, would you come and visit me in Hawaii when you die? She said, can I do that? I said, yeah, if you die, you can come in spirit. If the Catholic Church says I can do it, I'll come and visit you. But if this is against Catholic Church, sorry, you have to visit me.
Right. And of course, you know, for any person who wants to follow very closely Catholic theology, they would be informed by that and they would make their choices accordingly. But in a society that is religiously open and pluralistic and welcoming and tolerant of all the many different faith traditions, I think it's important to let individuals make the choice that is comfortable for them and to not impose a particular religious view on anyone else who may not hold that view.
So can you tell us then, how do we actually die? We don't want to talk about it. We only, if we are young, we know about our friends who may die from OD, car accidents, surfing or something. Can you explain how do we really die in hospices, in hospitals, and with the aid in dying?
Right. Well, you're talking to a lawyer, not a doctor. So maybe I know you had Dr. Nate on.
Yes,
that would have been a great question for him.
I asked him already, but I want to know from your perspective, how is this going through the legalizations of everything?
Right. And what I see for having worked in this field for 20 years as an educator and an advocate is that the default is always in the direction of more treatment, more interventions. And so if an individual with a terminal illness doesn't think carefully and plan carefully about their end of life, they will get onto a conveyor belt of treatment, hospitalization, emergency room, more interventions, another round of chemotherapy. And for some patients, that comes to the place where that is more torture than benefit. And so people do need to think ahead how much they're willing to endure with technology and invasive treatment at the end of life, and plan carefully so that they don't default into more hospitalizations, more intensive care than they want. Really important to think about and plan in advance for that.
So if in a hospice, for example, is it true that we often die from dehydration?
Patients in all 50 states have the right to refuse any unwanted treatment. So one kind of treatment that patients can refuse in order to bring about death, if they are ready to die, they can refuse food and fluid. And they can refuse it either through oral intake or if they have a feeding tube. You know, many patients approaching end of life will accept the insertion of a feeding tube, which is a surgical insertion, and food and fluid are delivered that way. Every patient can say no to that, and they can say that that should be stopped and withdrawn, and that will enable them to achieve death in a relatively short amount of time. That is one way that patients have to have some control.
If we look at this from a legal perspective, is this aid in dying, or is it suicide, assisted suicide? Is it a murder in some way? Because if I know I'm removing, as a physician, I'm removing something that can help you, how do we classify that according to the lawyer's language?
So it would not be aid in dying, because the term aid in dying refers specifically to a physician writing a prescription for a mentally competent, terminally ill patient for medication that the patient can ingest to bring about a peaceful death. That is what aid in dying refers to.
And how long does it take from taking the pill to dying?
You know, all of that information you can look at on the data that comes out of Oregon or Washington, because they collect and report that. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I think the most common experience is the patient takes the medication and within about 5 minutes they enter a very deeply sedated sleep-like state, and then they die within the next 30 to 90 minutes. And I know there have been longer interims until death arrives. It's a bit variable depending on the patient. But what you were referring to with the food and fluid, that would not be considered aid in dying, and that might take anywhere from several days to several weeks, depending on the patient's condition. So for some patients that will seem like a good choice, and for other patients it will seem too lingering.
Painful.
Yeah. Well, just, I think the literature is that patients can be kept comfortable, and it doesn't have to be painful, but it can take several weeks. It can be lingering.
So if we go back to the words, is terminal sedation a murder?
No, so terminal sedation is yet another choice that patients have. Terminal sedation was recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court in the cases we referred to earlier as a choice patients are empowered to make, and that's an important choice too. Terminal sedation is for patients who don't get relief with conventional pain and symptom management. So they're still in pain even with excellent aggressive pain and symptom management, even if they're enrolled in hospice. And so for that fraction of patients, which is estimated to be somewhere between 10 and 30% of dying patients, which
is still a lot.
It's a lot.
3 out of every third, every fourth.
Exactly. Those patients should be able to choose what is called terminal sedation, also called palliative sedation, also called sedation to unconsciousness. So it has many labels, not called murder. They can ask the physician to provide intravenous medication that induces complete unconsciousness, so they have no awareness of their suffering, and they have food and fluid withheld until death arrives. And again, for those patients, the interim until death arrives might be a couple of days, it might be longer, depending on their condition, etc. That is a choice that patients have in all 50 states.
Are patients informed about that?
That's a great question.
Yes.
Right. So there is a problem with patients not having information about the full array of choices. And we know from a lot of studies that patients don't know what their choices are. Less than half patients know that they can refuse an unwanted treatment. Less than 50% know that they can have as much pain medication as they need to get relief.
Why not?
No one likes to talk about it.
But am I, as a patient, or maybe my parent is in a hospital, are children of those terminally ill patients not asking doctors? Are doctors informed about it?
Right.
Who knows? Where can we get that information before we are already so much in pain that our brain doesn't function anymore?
It's a really significant problem. And so one of the things we've been working on at Compassion and Choices is creating a policy landscape where physicians are more clearly obligated to share information because they have the information, they are the gatekeepers. So, for example, in a number of states we have gone into the legislature with measures to ensure that patients get comprehensive counseling. We haven't done that in Hawaii yet. It might be something worth looking at. We did that recently in California and New York, and both those states enacted.
So you said you assure. How do you assure? In brochures? Where do people get information? We don't read much in this day and age. We just watch entertainment movies. How do we inform people?
Right. Well, so the idea of those legislative measures, the bills that we passed in California and New York, is that when a patient is diagnosed with a terminal illness, that the physician would then offer comprehensive counseling to the patient. The patient could accept it or refuse it, but the idea would be that that opportunity was offered. And I think most patients are hungry for information and would very much welcome an open discussion about what all of their choices are.
When they are terminally ill.
Yes, right. So it's so important.
Okay, so if we were to be in that kind of situation, now we have to face it. You said that terminal sedation is not a murder.
Right.
But also, who does it?
Well, in terminal sedation, that's a very specific practice. The physician comes to the bedside and puts intravenous medication into the patient's body. So that's a very active physician involvement.
It has nothing to do with the patient himself taking a pill?
No, but for aid in dying, which is a very different practice, that is where the patient obtains a prescription from the physician, but the patient must ingest the medication. The physician never administers it. So they're very different.
So physician who prescribes, is he aiding at suicide, assisting the suicide? Is he a murderer just by writing the prescription?
No, because that choice of the dying patient for a peaceful death is no kind of suicide.
Is that only in the state of Oregon, Montana, and Washington, or everywhere?
I think it's everywhere. I think that it's really important to bring a broad cultural awareness to the fact that the choice of a dying patient for a peaceful death is no kind of suicide. So what we're very active with now in Hawaii is a public and professional education campaign to bring people to recognize that in Hawaii there are many laws that support patients making choices about their medical care. And that collection, that constellation of laws, empowers patients to make their own medical decisions. And there is no barrier, there's no statute in Hawaii that prohibits end-of-life medical decision-making. Now, at the far edge of the horizon, Hawaii, as many states, has a statute, obviously, that prevents homicide, it prevents murder. Could some very eager prosecutor decide to try to prosecute a doctor for providing aid in dying? It's possible. I think that that case would have very little chance of success because, as I mentioned, Hawaii does vest citizens with autonomy.
Kathryn, we are running out of time now, but I definitely want to have the next show very specifically designed about practical cases for Hawaii.
Beautiful.
What can we hear? What can we do here? Exactly, specifically, very clearly, so people can get information. In the meantime, if they want to get more knowledge about it, they can go to Compassion and Choices.
Right. So we have a website, and I think we're going to post that on your video screen, and we have an 800 number. So we'd love for everyone who's interested in this issue and who is interested in patients receiving information and being able to make choices to be very active with us and support our work and get active in Hawaii, because it's a really exciting time.
Exciting time to die.
An exciting time to have more choice.
Wouldn't it be nice to die delicious?
It would. Beautiful.
That you are living a good life with dignity, then you die with dignity.
That's
you have
what we hope for.
Aid in living
Right.
from your friends and family, from your own mind, and then you can have aid in dying.
That's what we hope for.
Yeah.
And it can manifest.
Yeah, let's.
Beautiful.
Let's
Let's make it happen.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you so much.
See you next time for another show. In the meantime, you can call me if you need more information about Kathryn or something at 266-0717. Live delicious and die delicious. Bye.